Good afternoon. My name is David Johnson. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, CERL. Thank you for joining us today for our 8th installment of our briefing series on the ongoing conflicts with Israel and Hamas. We are going to discuss a very interesting topic today on perfidy. CERL is pleased to host experts in national security, military strategy, and the law of war to discuss these critical topics. CERL is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in national security, warfare, and democratic governance. Affiliated with the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania, CERL draws on from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in times of war and contemporary transnational conflicts. CERL brings together scholars, policymakers, professionals across the legal, military, intelligence, and business sectors to research, analyze, and to make policy recommendations that address today's challenging issues such as domestic violent extremism, the use of autonomous weapons, and the protections of civilians in war zones. CERL carries out its mission through conferences, symposia, research, policy papers, briefings, blog publishing, student projects, and other activities. We are pleased to host a summer internship program every year for students interested in national security. Our application window has been extended through Friday, April 5th. If you're a law or graduate level student interested in this opportunity or know of a student who may be interested, please find the link to apply in the chat. Now for a few housekeeping items before the session begins. Questions will be taken from the audience in approximately the last 20 minutes of the presentation. To ask a question, please enter your question into the Q&A box at any point during the conversation, then click send. This event will be recorded and posted on CERL's YouTube channel in short order. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Professor Claire Finkelstein, who founded CERL in 2012 and has served as CERL's faculty director since its inception. She is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much, Dave. As people who have listened to this briefing before know, we usually do an update of the week. And in this case, the big topic for the week is Rafah. I'm going to go right ahead and introduce one of our speakers for today, Professor Geoffrey S, who will discuss this situation in Rafah before we get to our main topic today, which is the topic of perfidy. Professor S is the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University School of Law. He joined the Texas Tech faculty after a 17-year tenure as a professor of law at South Texas College of Law, Houston. Prior to joining academia in 2005, Professor S served in the U.S. Army for 21 years, retiring in the rank of lieutenant colonel in 2004 and then serving the Army's senior law of war advisor. His teaching and scholarship focus in the law of armed conflict, national security law, criminal law, and criminal procedure. He has testified as an expert witness at the Military Commission in Guantanamo, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in federal court. He has authored more than 60 scholarly articles and is co-author of numerous important volumes, including the case book on national security law, from which I teach national security law. For those of you who know Jeff, he is an expert, probably the leading expert in national security law and warfare in the country, if not internationally. So I'm very grateful to have my dear friend and colleague, Geoffrey S, with us today. Jeff, before we start talking about perfidy, which is a fascinating and complex topic and about which you've written an amazing article, I want to talk about the situation in Rafah because this is very much on everybody's mind. And as you know, the UN Security Council issued a resolution calling for a ceasefire. This is a unilateral ceasefire, does not impose any conditions really other than that Israel would stop its offensive in Gaza. And instead of vetoing the ceasefire as this resolution, as it has done previously, the U.S. just abstained. This has got many people upset. Israel, for the moment, appears to be poised to go into Rafah nonetheless. And so the critical question is, should Israel do that or not? And can it defend itself against Hamas and disable Hamas's military capacity if it does not go into Rafah? You were in Israel about 3 weeks ago for a week with 3 retired U.S. flag officers trying to assess this situation. So I'd just like to begin with that topic and have your take on what the situation on the ground is and what your opinion is of the Rafah situation.
Well, first, thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to do these events, especially with you and your team who work so hard to coordinate this. And greetings to everybody out there who's watching. I was in Israel as part of an assessment group that was sponsored by JINSA, the Jewish Institute of National Security for America. And we're in the process now of writing a report that captures many of our observations. And we had remarkable access to military leaders in Israel, from the J3 of the Israeli Defense Forces down to spending a day with the commander and the staff of the 36th Armored Division, which was the first division into Gaza on the ground. And it was really eye-opening for me, and I think for all of us. I actually wrote something. If you go to the Cipher brief, you can find a piece I wrote titled Ground Truth that addresses some of my initial observations. What shocked me the most was the scale of the operation. I really had no idea how significant of a combined arms maneuver mission the Israeli Defense Forces felt compelled to execute in Gaza, and how conventional the Hamas military capability they were dealing with was. The Hamas forces were arrayed conventionally in 24 battalions, divided into certain brigades with regional responsibility. They were arrayed in defensive posture to defend against what they expected to be a frontal assault from the Israeli borders. The Israeli maneuver forces basically enveloped them. They outflanked them. They charged deep into Gaza as the initial penetration, and then turned around and came at Hamas from behind, which I think was one of the reasons why the Israeli casualties have been lower than I think even the IDF anticipated. They compromised Hamas's preparations for defending their positions through that maneuver. They put 5 divisions on the ground in Gaza at the high point, and their divisions are about the same size as US divisions. So about 100,000 ground maneuver forces conducting combined arms maneuver with heavy reliance on close air support, including the use of drones to provide immediate close air support to ground maneuver commanders, which was something that was new for the IDF. When we were there 3 weeks ago, their assessment was that they had rendered combat ineffective 18 of the 24 Hamas battalions, that there were 6 that remained intact, 4 or 5 of them in the Rafah area, and then there was 1 in another part of Gaza. And from an operational perspective, their mission was clear. Their mission was to destroy Hamas's combat capability. Doctrinally, that means that you close with the enemy and render the enemy combat ineffective, absent substantial reconstitution. They're not naive. They understand that the conflict at that point is very likely to devolve into an insurgency, and that they're going to be dealing with Hamas insurgent activities for a long time to come. As a matter of fact, the J3 mentioned to us that he has 2 14-year-old twin boys, and he said, I am firmly convinced that when they're 18 years old, they'll be fighting in Gaza. So their notion of destroying Hamas is different than kind of the public kind of narrative that you can completely eliminate Hamas as an entity. Their mission is to eliminate Hamas's ability to threaten them the way they did on October 7th, which I think is wholly consistent with the scope of their right under the inherent right of self-defense. So Rafah,
So Jeff, what does that lead you to conclude about the justification of going into Rafah,
yeah,
given
so yeah.
that the vast majority of the population, civilian population, is clustered in Rafah?
Yeah,
And
they know that they cannot allow those 6 battalions to remain intact. That would become a nucleus of a force that could reconstitute a more conventional threat. And by the way, one of the things they took us to a warehouse where they had a lot of captured equipment, and it just blew us away. The volume and the capacity of combat capability that Hamas had been armed with. But they also know that they have to do it in a way that maximizes the mitigation of civilian risk. So what they were telling us was that they've got to figure out a way to evacuate most of those civilians before they close with that enemy, in order to defeat the enemy. Now, in terms of
now,
the
let me just stop you right there and ask you a quick question about that. Is that because that's a condition that the U.S. is imposing for U.S.
no,
support, or is that because they view that as necessary under the laws of war, or under just a moral commitment to
yeah.
humanitarian support and civilian casualty mitigation?
My sense was 2 and 3. They saw it as a legal obligation under the constant care obligation, and they saw it as a moral imperative. They also recognize very clearly the strategic disaster that results when they're already perceived as being indifferent to civilian casualties, which, by the way, I think they find very frustrating because they make extensive efforts to clear civilians out of areas of the most significant combat. And they showed us videos of examples where IDF forces were creating evacuation corridors and Hamas operatives were firing at the civilians, trying to force them to stay in certain areas. So I think they understand that they have to figure out some way to get the civilians out of there as best they can before they close with the enemy. I think what's going to be interesting is what Hamas does to prevent that, because that's Hamas's final shield. And we're talking about perfidy, and there's some relationship there. I think also that on the resolution, I think we all know if it had been contingent on release of hostages, it's something that they probably would have considered tolerable. The problem, I think, for them was that there was no linkage. The headlines are interesting, though, aren't they? That the UN votes to order an immediate ceasefire. The UN also voted to order the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, but that seems to get omitted from the headlines. So my guess is that the Israelis, and this is a guess, I don't have insight on this, that the IDF has come to a point where they realize they've got these Hamas battalions cornered. They don't have to be, they can give it some time to get civilians out of there, to make it consistent with the expectation of the international community. I don't think that they are going to launch a major ground operation in Rafah until the Ramadan period is over. I would be surprised if they do. But I think that they are going to have to close into that area and root out Hamas and gain control of those border crossings, which is a vital strategic objective for long-term control of the threat emanating from Gaza. They can't allow Hamas to continue to use those underground tunnels into Egypt as sources of smuggling arms, ammunition, and equipment. So I think you're going to see a ground operation there. It's not going to be on the scale of earlier operations. By the way, one of the things that I thought was fascinating was how they talked, this was the division commander, talked about the evolution of their tactics. That when they basically said that every house they encountered in Gaza City was a pre-positioned fighting position. They had weapons and ammunition in every house. And this is one of the points I make in that piece I wrote. We think of the fight in Gaza as a subterranean fight. It was a multi-level fight. Hamas was operating underground, on the ground, and above the ground in the civilian buildings, and they were interconnected. The buildings themselves were interconnected, so Hamas fighters could move from one to the other where there were pre-positioned battle positions. And so initially, the IDF forces felt compelled to do a lot of building destruction. But as the fight evolved, they decided to assume greater risk and do more physical raids of these buildings. And so, as the commander noted, if you look at the physical destruction in Gaza City, it's significantly more extensive than in Khan Yunis. And that was because of an evolution of their tactics to mitigate the necessity of conducting that type of destruction.
Right.
So I don't think it's going to be as extensive as Gaza City or Khan Yunis, but there will have to be a maneuver operation into the Rafah area to finally eliminate those last 6 battalions.
Okay. That is fascinating. Jeff, thank you so much for that discussion. I want to bring in now our other speaker for today, Ido Rosenzweig. Dr. Ido Rosenzweig is the Director of Research of Belligerencies, Terrorism, and Cyber, and a research fellow at the Minerva Center for the Study of Law under Extreme Conditions at the University of Haifa. He is a co-founder and chairperson of ALMA, which is the Association for the Promotion of International Humanitarian Law. Ido is an international lawyer with both practical and academic expertise in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and has provided consultancy services to different organizations, including different NGOs and UN agencies. I should also say that Ido has written an extensive text on the law of perfidy, is a major expert in this field. So between Jeff and Ido, we have probably the 2 greatest experts on this topic, on the topic of perfidy, and I'm thrilled to have you both here. So first of all, let's begin by talking about what perfidy is. What is the concept of perfidy? And maybe, Ido, you can kick us off on that.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and then it's always great to be together with Jeff here on the panel. Perfidy is a very unique aspect of international humanitarian law. It involves the notion of fair fight and chivalry in its background, but the notion is that you should not take advantage of the protection that international humanitarian law, the laws of war, provides to a person in order to take advantage of that protection and harm the adversary. So if, for example, to pretend to be an injured person, which is entitled for protection, to pretend to surrender, to pretend to be a civilian on that matter, in order to take advantage, and this is a very, very important element, taking advantage of that trust and use that trust in order to harm the adversary who's coming to either help you or is coming with lower their guns because they are not expecting you to be any harm, to have any threat, to be any threat for them. And that's a very, very important element. And the last part is that you have to do that. Perfidy, which is enshrined in Additional Protocol 1, says that you're not allowed to use perfidious manners in order to kill, wound, or capture the adversary. And well, we might go deeper in a second about what are the differences between kill and wound on the one hand and capture on the other hand, which has been a great deal of the research I've done on the notion of perfidy and treachery. But the main idea is that if you're taking advantage, you're actually taking advantage. So the threat of doing that is an interesting discussion, but this is, as Jeff, I'm sure, can even elaborate more than me, is a result-based contact. And this is where it becomes very, very interesting.
Right, and maybe let's turn to you, Jeff, to explain what that means. What does it mean to say it's result-based? And you have an extremely interesting paper discussing this aspect of perfidy.
Well, let's start by what I kind of remember learning as a JAG officer dealing with this issue. We would think of perfidy as something you shouldn't do. It's a conduct violation. So it's very common to hear people talk about perfidious conduct. But as Ido notes, starting as far back as 1899 and 1907 with the regulations annexed to the Hague Conventions, following through in 1977 with Additional Protocol 1, the ICC statute, all of the definitions of perfidy are result focused, not conduct focused. In other words, you don't violate Article 37 or the ICC crime of perfidy by engaging in perfidious conduct unless you inflict the requisite result. And as Ido notes, there is universal consensus that killing or wounding satisfies that result requirement. There's some debate over whether capture fits in there. The United States says no. Protocol 1 says yes. But what struck me as interesting is that that makes perfidy more of a kind of an offense focus, when from an operational standpoint, we need perfidy to be a regulatory norm. And the regulatory norm shouldn't really focus on whether you achieve the treacherous or dishonorable result you're trying to achieve. It should focus on two elements. One, are you engaging in conduct that would qualify as perfidy? And two, are you doing it with the requisite intent to exploit the enemy's respect for the law of war? And so that's why in this paper that you referred to, I focused on why I think we should place more emphasis on what I would call attempted perfidy, where you have the specific intent to exploit the enemy's respect for the law, you engage in the conduct. That is what we should be condemning, not just whether or not you produce the prohibited result. And it is kind of interesting that it really is the one conduct of hostilities rule that is result oriented. All the other rules, launching an illegal attack, launching a disproportionate attack, those are all conduct-based rules. We focus, the actus reus is the decision, the conduct. But perfidy is defined with an actus reus that is result-oriented. And I think that renders it a little bit under-inclusive. Treating it as an attempt solves that, but also reinforces, I think, the critical importance of establishing that illicit intent, as Ido notes, because that's the real rub. There are a lot of situations in war where you could have conduct that you might think is perfidy, but you just are not convinced sufficiently that it was engaged in for that illicit purpose. And without that illicit purpose, you don't have perfidy.
All right. So what prompted our interest in this important topic in the current conflict, and you know that this briefing series is devoted to looking at hard legal questions that arise in the Israel-Hamas conflict, is a raid that occurred in the end of January on the West Bank in Yemen, in which Israeli security forces entered the Ibn Sina hospital in Yemen and shot 3 men in the hospital wards. And the question that we were asked to opine on, I was asked to opine on, as someone who studies the law of war, is whether or not this counts as perfidy. And so I began to study this and, of course, turned to Ido's paper and started to ask Jeff about this. And I could suddenly see the incredible complexities that opened up about this event. Among other things, this was not an IDF raid. This was Israeli security forces, not in the technical zone of conflict, but it's on the West Bank. And we all know from U.S. law, of course, the difference between Title 50 and Title 10, the difference between intelligence operations and military operations. And that got me thinking, of course, about the complexities of the situation on the West Bank, where you do have arguably a mix of contexts. So let me ask you, Ido, to try to disentangle that for us. Tapes, video, closed surveillance video of the event show Israeli security forces disguised as doctors, disguised as women, carrying a wheelchair, going through the hallways of the hospital. Then they apparently entered a room in which 3 Hamas individuals from Hamas were in that room. According to news reports, one of the individuals was actually a patient and in a hospital bed. The other two individuals were not receiving medical care. They were armed. I believe all three of them were armed. And there were weapons found in the room. It is not clear from reports whether or not there was any attempt to capture or arrest these individuals, or whether or not they were immediately targeted and killed.
Yeah. Well, as you noted towards the end, there are so many unknowns in that situation that we need to know, first of all, what questions should we ask in order to understand what are we looking at? So the first question is, under what framework of law are we operating? Are we operating under international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, or are we talking about law enforcement situation? And then the mere fact that the West Bank is under belligerent occupation by Israel means that Israel has both rights and obligations towards that territory. The IDF and the security forces are operating both as law and order, law enforcement regime, and also under the laws of war paradigm. And that means that if the operation is a law enforcement operation to detain a person, then international law and national law, to that extent just as well, allows undercover operations all the time. We've heard a lot about law enforcement, regular law enforcement operations undercover to capture different threat, including threat of terrorism and threat to national security, but also other types of crimes. There is no restriction on the use of undercover forces for the purpose of law enforcement. So that's the one.
Now, can I stop you there, Ido, and just say why is that? Why? I mean, let's just ask at least from a moral point of view, if not from a legal point of view. And maybe this is too general a question to answer, but why is it okay to use disguises, ruses, trickery on the intelligence side, but not on the military side? And maybe that's a question. I'll ask you, and then I'm going to ask Jeff the same question.
So I haven't even got to the intelligence. I'm still in law enforcement, and law enforcement not under the international, not under the laws of war.
Yeah,
Under law enforcement, we've seen that in organized crime, mainly, where you need to get into the forces in order to get some evidence. And you actually have UN recommendations on using these type of techniques in order to be able to fight regular crimes. And the whole notion behind it, I think, is that under law enforcement, you're not supposed to kill anyone unless it's last resort. So there is no genuine day-to-day threat by getting into the forces of trying to kill a person or trying to or wounding a person. You're just trying to get the information in order to stop the crime. Under international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, the situation is more complicated. And as we noted before, there is some differences between kill and capture, which is the same differentiation I just made with law enforcement, versus capture, which again brings that same notion or same reasoning that we've had here. And we can see that there are two very, very similar prohibitions in international, in the laws of armed conflict that refer to perfidious manners. And that's the prohibition on treachery, which appears both in the Hague regulations and again in the Rome Statute as a war crime. On the other hand, we have Article 37, which Jeff mentioned in Additional Protocol 1, which the difference between them, which prohibits perfidious manners. The main difference between them is that the prohibition on treacherous killing or wounding doesn't add the notion of capture. And that goes to the Hague regulations and just as well to the Rome Statute. So under the Rome Statute and under Hague regulations, you are not allowed to resort treacherous ways in order to kill or wound an adversary. where in the additional protocol 1, the prohibition is to use perfidious manners in order to kill, wound, or capture a person.
Right.
And
So
this
that's
is,
the essential difference, right? You can
yeah,
use trickery to capture, but you can't use it to kill.
I
you
think
can
there's
use
more
trickery.
fun. Yeah.
Go
You
ahead,
can
Jeff.
use trickery.
I-
Sorry, let me just finish that.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can use trickery for intelligence, for destruction of buildings and sabotage and
Mm-hmm.
these kind of things. And you
Mm-hmm.
can use trickery to capture. You're not allowed to use it to kill or wound.
Right.
And this is the framework. You're allowed to cause damage, and you're allowed to get information intelligence by using to perfidy or treachery.
Right.
Under treachery, you're allowed to capture, and under perfidy, you're also not allowed to capture. So these are the main differences. The capture is the main difference between treachery and perfidious manner. Sorry, Jeff, you're about to
So,
say
Jeff, I
something.
assume you agree with that.
Well, I do agree that there is inconsistency between Protocol 1 and the other sources. You know, it's interesting. The United States is
So
all
sorry, hang on. Just make clear what that inconsistency is exactly.
whether capture
Is that
is within the scope of perfidy. The
Right.
United States is all over the map on this. I went back and looked at the declassified Joint Chief of Staff review of additional Protocol 1. They had no objection to Article 37. They said that they thought Article 37 was a good clarification of the law. Then I looked in the new Army doctrinal publication on the law of land warfare, the successor to FM 2710. It defines perfidy requiring capture, kill or injure. It does not include capture. And yet there is a crime in the Military Commission Act of perfidy that applies to any person who kills, captures, or wounds. So we are imposing capture on our enemy as a crime subject to military commission jurisdiction. It's not in the FM. Let me go back to your point about law
Jeff,
enforcement.
can just before you do, let me just clarify one thing about what you just said, and then we'll go back. Does the inconsistency get resolved there depending on whether or not the capture is in armed conflict?
Oh, no.
Or whether or not the capture is in law enforcement?
Listen, I think there's a more fundamental reason why this is tolerable in law enforcement. Because in law enforcement, if I walk into a room as a uniformed police officer and I walk into a room of organized criminals, they don't have a presumptive right to kill me. The law doesn't allow them to use deadly force against me. So the whole idea of perfidy is that I am negating your presumptive authority to kill me by pretending to be somebody who's entitled to protection. And that equation can only arise in a situation of hostilities in armed conflict. In any other situation, because there is no presumptive right to kill, there's no breach of trust by pretending to be something other than a law enforcement officer.
You're saying it goes with combatant immunity.
Well, no, what I'm saying is it goes with belligerent status.
Right,
Because
belligerent
if
status.
the enemy sees me walk in a room and I'm dressed in my uniform,
Right.
I am subject to his use of deadly force under international law. If he sees a cop walk in a room in a law enforcement operation, the mafia guy doesn't have a legal right to pull out a gun and shoot the cop.
Right.
So when the cop dresses as a civilian, the cop is not exploiting the other side's obligation not to use deadly force. That obligation already exists.
Great. So go ahead. I cut you off about wanting to go back to something Ido said earlier.
No, that
was it. Okay.
Yeah, I think the issue of capture, with the United States, I find fascinating. It's not look, you and I worked on an extensive report on the military commission. It's not the only aspect of the military commission where what's good for the gander apparently is not good for the goose, where we impose liability on our enemy that we don't necessarily accept for ourselves. But I do think that it's pretty interesting that when the Joint Chiefs reviewed Protocol 1, they objected to a lot of provisions. That's why we rejected Protocol 1. But Article 37, there's no objection whatsoever. They say, we think it's a good clarification of the law of perfidy. So, you know, where this is, As a matter of customary international law, I don't know, but Ido and I are both in complete concurrence that if you kill or injure as a result of that illicit intent, you have definitely violated the prohibition on perfidy.
Good. Okay. So now, Ido, let's talk about how this applies to the Yemen situation. Okay. Because, and I don't know how much people followed of this fascinating technical discussion, but basically the answer is it depends on the context, right? And so we're very context dependent in trying to understand the lawfulness or not of that operation. So help us understand how you would assess if someone came to you and said, hey, here's what we're planning to do. Is this operation lawful?
Well, my first question is, what is the order given to the forces when they go there? Is it an order to capture, or is it order to target the person? Now, it's clear that in order to capture a person might escalate to a situation, and especially if that person is expecting some hostilities, and then we know that the person that was stayed at the hospital at that time, and he was the object of that operation, rather than for capture or for targeting, was there, and it was also had some associates who were armed. So it wasn't a very simple operation, but usually undercover operations are not that simple, especially to capture a person. And in many cases, there are situations of escalation. Now, it's very important to know what were the orders given to the forces, but also what did they do when they encountered with that adversary. So whether they were trying to gain trust, use the trust from the way they were dressed, the way they pretended to be, or when they were operated with, with their arms visible, and they were audible, it was clear that they are adversary forces, then it would be hard to argue that there is a situation of trust here betrayed by the forces, and therefore situation of perfidy. So it's a very question of what were the orders and what did they do? Because in my view, when you're actually encounter with the target, if your operation is to kill a person, then it would be very interesting to hear what Jeff says about it. It's a question of at what point perfidy begins. Does it begin when you actually enter into the territory and you start the operation, or only the trust can start and be broken only when you are actually visible or traceable by the person that you are actually targeting, the person who you're aiming for? And if you are talking about the latter option, then, well, you only need to show yourself towards the end. But if you're talking about the first option, then
Right.
every step towards the way would be a part of a treacherous operation.
Ido, does it matter that two of the individuals were not actual patients and that they were armed? So there were two individuals who arguably were engaging in shielding and illicit use of a hospital, potentially to hide operations or to shelter from law enforcement by being present in that hospital and hide in civilian infrastructure. Does that make a difference to the analysis of whether or not the legality of the kill versus capture aspect of the raid?
Yeah, I think that if we are under the law enforcement paradigm, it shouldn't change anything at all. If we are in the laws of war paradigm, there is a question of whether or not just being there with their guns constitute, and I know that what I'm going to say is an old disagreement between Jeff and I, but whether or not they are taking direct part in the hostilities at the time, where I'm going to put the brackets of the actual discussion, whether they are under the paradigm of continuous combat function as the International Committee of the Red Cross defines it, or unlawful combatants in the American version of if they are within the framework of taking direct part in the hostilities, well, who they are already makes that difference, and they are targetable just as well. And it doesn't matter if they are there as bodyguard or they are there just to visit their friends. They are targetable because of their status. But if they are not, then the mere fact that they have weapons on them, I don't think changes the operation. It can just change the endpoint of are you able to capture, or is it expected to escalate at the time? And I will just add another point, that if the escalation is expected, then the forces should be giving adequate instructions what to do towards when they get closer to the target, in order to make sure that they don't conduct treacherous killing or wounding.
So, Jeff, let me turn to you on this, and of course, the disagreement that Ido is talking about is one that you and I have had as well, whether or not the status of civilians participating in hostilities should be considered as civilians serving a continuous combat function, or whether or not they should be considered unlawful combatants in the more American sense. But I don't know if that affects the analysis here, actually.
It doesn't for me. Look,
right, I don't think it does.
Look,
yeah.
if we are going to apply DPH analysis, we're assuming that this operation was conducted as part of the conduct of hostilities, which brings perfidy into the issue. And even if you assume that these individuals are subject to deliberate attack as a measure of first resort, because either they're unprivileged belligerents or they're civilians engaged in a continuous combat function, you still have to comply with the prohibition against perfidy. So
Right.
if you're feigning civilian status in order to take advantage of their alleged respect for the immunity of civilians in order to kill them or wound them, and I would say, I think there's a growing view that capture would fit within there, but I'll set that aside for now. You've got a problem. The fact that they're in a hospital with weapons doesn't automatically result in the hospital losing its protection. Wounded belligerents go into hospitals all the time, and the
Right.
weapons are stored. They usually don't keep them under the blanket with them.
Right.
But that brings in I saw one of the questions. That raises a completely different issue of, do you have to issue a warning to the hospital to cease and desist, et cetera, et cetera. I think the more important aspect of what Ido talked about was, if this operation was conducted as a constabulary mission, a law enforcement type mission, right? Then I don't think perfidy becomes particularly relevant. I think the issue there becomes, was there a reasonable assessment that these security forces faced an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm? Because they might not have, and we have to be very careful. We don't judge the legitimacy of an act of self-defense on the actual situation. We judge it on the reasonably perceived situation. And so, as Ido notes, there is so much we don't know. What was the intelligence briefing? What was the threat briefing? What was the expectation? What did their sources tell them that they had in those beds with them? I don't know any of that. So when we see the video where you see a guy dressed as a civilian infiltrate the hospital in a law enforcement operation, they may very well have been under orders to apprehend these individuals and made a split-second judgment that deadly force was necessary under the circumstances. That's something that deserves to be investigated. The last thing I would say is Ido's point about, is it perfidy? Do you have to wait till the enemy sees you? Or could it be perfidy before then based on the orders? This is my whole point about what I think is the illogic of a result-focused prohibition. Because as a legal advisor, what I want to do is make sure my forces conduct themselves honorably in accordance with the law. I want them to know the line between the permissibility, for example, of wearing enemy uniforms to infiltrate versus wearing enemy uniforms to fight. I want them to know the difference between ruses and perfidy. And again, I think part of this problem is the consequence of this requirement of kill or injure as an element of perfidy. Because even under Ido's hypothetical, if the enemy can see me dressed as a civilian and I intend to kill the enemy and I throw a grenade that's a dud, I have not committed the crime of perfidy because the grenade didn't go off. And to me, that's illogical, because what we really should be focused on is the concurrence between your treacherous conduct and your treacherous intent, not the ultimate result.
So I want to get a bunch of the questions in, but before we do that, there's one other topic that I just want to cover briefly, lest we think that the Israelis are the only side using treachery and perfidious conduct in this conflict. There are reports, for example, in the tragic moment in which the IDF killed 3 of the hostages, that while that incident is still under investigation, I believe it is still under investigation, though some preliminary results have already been announced or released, that one of the reasons why those IDF officers were confused was that the Hamas had been playing tapes with Hebrew voices, and that they had been using techniques deliberately to try to confuse IDF members, so that they saw these individuals and they saw the signaling and the surrender, the white flags, the surrender, the fact that they were shirtless. The IDF was very clear that they did not act according to protocol. But on the other hand, what do you do about the fact if the other side is deliberately manipulating those protocols to try to confuse members of the military? How do you then assess the resulting conduct and resulting confusion? Ido, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, well, what you're describing is probably one of the most unfortunate scenarios in a situation that is full with unfortunate scenarios.
Yeah.
Whenever we talk about the prohibition on treachery and other similar prohibitions under the laws of war, the textbook always says that the entire notion behind those orders is to maintain the protection for the civilians, for the wounded, for the people who surrender, to maintain that protection so they know that if they do it, they are safe. If they don't actually engage in conflict, they are safe from attack. And they are the first, these types of person would be the first to be harmed from any modus operandi that uses on a regular basis treacherous and perfidious manners. And this is what we see here. We know that Hamas is using those manners over and over again, and the ones who get harmed by it are uninvolved civilians. And in this specific scenario, 3 hostages that were amazing. They show amazing bravery by attempting to escape and going there. And they've shown a lot of wisdom in the ways they tried to explain who they are and show that they are Israeli hostages who are trying to break free. And because of all the manipulation that has been going on by Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, IDF soldiers weren't sure what happened. Clearly, it was something wrong to do, but it's almost impossible to judge them and say, well, they did this, they should have done this rather than do that. In this very, very complicated situation, it should be investigated, it should be inquired. Perhaps disciplinary measures should be taken place. I don't know, that's the Israeli military advocate general's role to deal with, and the commanders, they have the role to make sure that this won't happen again, or to reduce the chances that it will happen again. But in this situation where your enemy is constantly misusing on purposely, abusing actually the laws of war, this is the outcome, that the person who are supposed to be protected by the laws of war are getting harmed by it.
Jeff, what is your view of that? And what are you supposed to do in
Well,
that
look,
situation? What would you advise Israeli troops who are facing this kind of barrage of confusion and trickery of tactics?
listen, I think this kind of confirms for me why we have to be equally censorious of attempted perfidy as we are of consummated perfidy, because it's the attempt of the perfidy that is so pervasive and that has eroded confidence in symbols of protection. Hesitation in close combat has mortal consequences. This is why there's no capture instead of kill obligation when you're fighting an enemy. Because if I have to hesitate for a moment to decide whether I really need to shoot, it may give the enemy an advantage that results in me or one of my soldiers being killed. This is the reality of warfare. These symbols of protection are supposed to be sacrosanct because they result in refraining from engaging in hostilities in a situation where normally refraining from doing so can have that mortal consequence. And every time an enemy is allowed to erode that confidence, whether they achieve their perfidious result or not, undermines, as Ido says, a fundamental protection, and is going to lead to two things: more casualties of people who should not have been hurt, and more reasonable mistakes on the side of the force that's inflicting those casualties. And we don't want mistakes in war. We want to minimize mistakes, and we want to minimize situations where we have to accept that a tragic result occurred that shouldn't have occurred, but it was reasonable under the circumstances. In terms of the forces on the ground, I'd say there, but for the grace of God, go I, because they are fighting a terrible fight against a determined enemy that's been preparing a area as a giant battle position for 17 or 18 years. And they're being led by 19 and 20-year-old lieutenants in close combat who are doing the best they can under miserable situations. You know, one thing I'll finish with, Ido says, you can't really judge what happened unless you understand the full context. The sad reality is everybody judges what happens without considering the full context of the situation. And that's the real shame of all of the, I think, the overbroad and ill-informed commentary on what is happening on the ground in Gaza.
All right, let's go to some of the questions that we have. So first, and this is directly relevant to what we have just been talking about, but Jeff, it goes to your initial conversation about the visit that you had. Are the 6 battalions that you mentioned, are they hiding in the hospitals? Where are they located?
First off, I mean, we have to be careful about this whole issue of hospitals. There's a difference between using the hospital itself for military purposes and using it as a shield for underground facilities that you're using for military purposes.
Right.
I think that the majority of Hamas belligerent operatives are still operating underground. And this Hamas subway system was even more extensive than the Israelis expected. What they predict now that there's ultimately about 500 miles of multi-level subterranean tunnels, server farms, missile construction factories, command posts. It's unbelievable the extent. I mean, I remember in 2015 when we visited and they took us into one of the tunnels that penetrated into Israel, and I was blown away with its sophistication. That was kindergarten compared to what's been developed since then. So there is ample space and resources to sustain these forces in a concealed location in and around Rafah. And so the fact that you don't see like a command post with a flag and security forces around it should not be taken as an indication that they're not there.
So Jeff, one more question about this. Your visit, I take it, was before the battles that took place at Shifa Hospital?
No, it was after.
It was after. Okay. Does that affect your view at all about the potential benefits of going into Rafah? Because the one argument sort of on the other side of this is that going into Rafah won't quite do as much as the IDF hopes because they're just going to reconstitute in other parts of Gaza.
Well, to reconstitute, you have to be destroyed to begin with. I mean, you can't tell a military commander, don't worry about destroying the enemy because in the future he might reconstitute. And the mission is to destroy the enemy's combat capability. I think there are important lessons from Al-Shifa, though. One of them is don't oversell the enemy situation. I mean, that was one of the mistakes that the IDF spokesperson made. They made it sound like they were going to find the Pentagon underneath Al-Shifa. And when they weren't able to demonstrate that, it led to criticism. They found evidence that there was a command bunker and operations under Al-Shifa. That was a legitimate target. To me, the irony of that whole narrative was this suggestion that the Israelis, because they didn't find everything they said they were going to find, they somehow did something they shouldn't have done. They conducted a ground raid into this underground enemy tunnel in an effort to mitigate the damage and destruction to the hospital itself. They got no credit for that precautionary measure.
Which is a highly dangerous thing to do.
It was a highly dangerous thing to do. And I think after multiple warnings to Hamas, they would have been justified in striking that underground bunker as a matter of law. But as a matter of policy, they realized the danger for that. And I think that shows that they are going to be cautious in Rafah. They've got to figure out a way to balance the need to close with and defeat this enemy with the strategic imperative of rebutting as much as humanly possible the narrative of indifference to civilians in that operation.
Yeah. Ido, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that there are two interesting points that on timing, there are like one at the beginning and one very, very current. At the beginning, I think Israel and Israeli politicians has made a big mistake by raising the bar of what should be the goal of the operation, goal of the war, which is to destroy Hamas abilities completely to govern and to fight on the one hand, and to release all the hostages on the one hand. And at some point, I think they also said without reoccupying the Gaza Strip, since 20 years after Israel has withdrawn from the Gaza Strip. And I think by raising the bar so high, they trap themselves into a very, very difficult situation, difficult conflict, which had to bring situations like what we've seen in Al-Shifa hospital. But at the same time, when we look at current events, Israel just returned to fight. IDF just returned to fight in Al-Shifa and has found there so many Hamas operatives, so many Hamas fighters that went back to Al-Shifa because they thought that, well, Israel already left that area, so it's safe again to go to Al-Shifa and use that protection. And so we see how the modus operandi of Hamas is it's within its nature to go into those supposedly safe places and to take advantage of that protection on a regular basis. And the mere fact that there was a warning which allowed a lot of them to evacuate at the beginning, and at the same time Israel, as and especially with the IDF spokesperson's presentation about Shifa Hospital, made some tactical mistakes. There's no doubt about that. I think, by the way, if we look at the most current development that we've seen, we have today's ruling from the International Court of Justice that was just published an hour ago about the provisional measures. It seems that Israel will have to be even more careful about how they're going to operate in Rafah. And it's going to be very, very complicated in the coming days to see how Israel is operating. And then at the beginning, Jeff said something about he doesn't think that Israel is going to strike hard during the months of Ramadan. And I think it is part of the Security Council resolution. It has part with the ICJ's decisions from today about taking care of the humanitarian needs of the civilian population in Gaza. And we are entering into a very, very complicated phase of the conflict. And if we go back to the standard that was set the goal that was set by the Israeli government at the beginning of the conflict, that last part of the conflict in the south of Gaza, with the entire humanitarian situations that is going on within the south of Gaza, the resolution of the Security Council, the decision of the ICJ, I think that this is going to be a very, very difficult phase of the conflict, and I have unfortunately no idea how much time, effort, resources, and human life it's going to cost us.
Let me just say, I think you're absolutely right, Ido, that this is an exceedingly complex part of the conflict. Searle is continuing to study civilian mitigation reduction techniques, and we are working with the Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict group with the Army to look at the U.S. protocols around civilian harm mitigation and to study the conflict in Gaza and to understand more about civilian harm mitigation. We'll be doing some of that work over the summer in the summer internship. So again, as Dave Johnson, our executive director, announced at the beginning of the session, if anyone is aware of students, mostly law students and graduate students who may be interested in this opportunity, we're looking still for talented students who may be interested in joining this work. Thanks so much, Ido, Jeff, for joining our discussion today. Absolutely fascinating and incredibly complex issues that we're talking about, and of course of the greatest importance worldwide and in the current conflict. I hope that you will both come back. We may be having one more briefing, after which we'll suspend during the summer. We'll be announcing that, of course, through our email channels and in other ways. Please feel free to email us and at our Searle email, which is available on our website, to give us feedback about the briefing series. Will likely take up again in the fall, depending on the situation. And hopefully the conflict will be long since over by then, but there are always lessons to be learned, and if not, we should be back in the fall with briefing. Thank you again to our guests for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you. Stay safe, Ido.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us today. The event recording will be available on Searle's YouTube channel shortly. Stay tuned for information about our programming by joining Searle's mailing list. The link to sign up is available in the chat. We look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.